All right, here we go. We are now in the third chapter of Esther. And now the plot thickens. It's just so interesting how so much of Esther, there's kind of this build-up of the plot. And now we really do start to get into it. I mean, kind of the real major conflict in the book of Esther. But so here we are at Esther chapter 3. And I'm just going to read the first six verses here. But then we'll go back and kind of look at it piece by piece. So here, Esther chapter 3, the first verse. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and did obeisance to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" When they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would avail. For he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance to him, Haman was infuriated, but he thought it beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So, indeed, the plot thickens. Now we get to the major conflict of the book of Esther. That now we find this plot to wipe out all of the Jewish people. And so, we've observed, I think, in this book that there is not a widespread, sort of anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews. Again, this was at a time when the Jews were actually being favored by the Persian government in a way, being sent back to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple. But clearly there is some hatred against the Jews, and to such an extent now that this official in the Persian king's court, this official Haman, enacts a plan to wipe out all the Jews. So very, very sad, very frightening now for the Jewish people. Their lives are now all in grave danger. But just to go back through this now, piece by piece, after these things, again, at the first verse, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman. Okay, after these things, that is, after Esther herself has been elevated to a royal position. Now it's interesting, Esther. It took a little while for Esther to come into this story. The first chapter really centered on the Persian court, the king, his feasts, his first queen Vashti. And the plan to find a new queen. I mean, so it's interesting that Esther herself did not really appear at the beginning of the story. And now for this chapter, once again, Esther disappears. I mean, you won't find Esther in this particular chapter, in the third chapter. Now we kind of return to the Persian king. And similar to the first chapter, where the Persian king's pride was injured by the refusal of his queen to appear at his banquet. Now it is this high official, Haman, and it's his pride that is injured, which is going to likewise, sort of result in this nationwide sort of consequence. I mean, where in the first chapter, it was the king looking for a new queen, and so you had this nationwide search for a new queen. Now you've got this nationwide response. They're going to wipe out all the Jews in the kingdom. So, some similar interesting elements here in the story. But I think one of the big questions here in these opening verses of the third chapter is why, number one, why is it that Mordecai refused to bow to Haman? Haman, clearly, I'd say, Haman, this villain now. Haman is really the villain of this story. And Haman seems to kind of have some things in common with his king, Ahasuerus. These guys have big egos. They do not like to be slighted. They do not want to be publicly insulted. And if they are insulted, there are going to be big consequences. I mean, both the king and Haman have that in common. So again, the question, why is it that Mordecai would refuse to bow down to Haman? And I want to just sort of hold on to that question for a little bit. But we can see actually in the second verse here, that this Haman, this Haman, he again has a big ego, and he expects people to honor that. He has been given a high position in this royal court, and he expects everybody else to show their respect for that position. And now this goes back, to that comment, that Deneen made a moment ago about the respect that we owe to authorities, to government, and that is certainly a biblical principle. I mean, in Romans 13 is one of the big, one of the important passages where we see this in Scripture. Romans 13, which opens with Paul saying, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God." And so, that's important for Christians to remember, is that, God does not ask us to ignore our government, but rather to obey it. And yet, nonetheless, the other passage that we so often then want to hold in kind of in mind along with that is from Acts, where the apostles are told to stop preaching. And they say we have to obey God rather than man. And so there are moments when government officials, authorities ask believers to disobey God, and then in those cases we say, well, we will obey our government, but there is a higher authority, and there's a higher allegiance that we have, so that when those two come into conflict, we have to obey God. Now, I bring all that up to sort of raise the question of whether or not this is what's going on. I mean, here in Esther chapter 3, verse 2, it says, "All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and did obeisance to Haman." And that's because the king had commanded everybody to do that. The king elevates this man, Haman, this official, and he expects everyone to show their reverence for his authorities. And the king asks everyone to do this, commands everybody to do this. And this is the way of this Persian king. I mean, remember, he has rules about everything. Even when you come to his parties, there are rules about how much you drink, rules about how many days it's required of his harem, to prepare to be with him. I mean, there are rules about everything in this kingdom, and even about how you are to treat his officials. But Mordecai would not do this. Now, I think this is just it's worth raising this question, whether or not the king was asking this Jew, Mordecai, to do something that went against his faith. And I think that's it's a valid question to ask that. I mean, simply by asking Mordecai to bow down. I mean, was this itself a form of idolatry? And it's interesting. Now, if you look at verse 2, there are two verbs that get used in verse 2 about the way that people are supposed to honor Haman. These two verbs. In the NRSV translation, the two verbs are bow down and to do obeisance. Or in the King James, the two verbs, the way it's translated, is to bow and reverence Haman, okay? And those two verbs get repeated in this story about the way that the king commands people to show their respect, and the ways that Mordecai refuses the king's command. Now, it's interesting because those verbs, I mean, I looked these up in Hebrew, and both of these verbs certainly describe ways that people show their reverence to God. That is, both of these verbs are used to describe the ways that believers will worship the Lord, or conversely, the ways that people will bow down to idols as well. That is, these verbs are used to describe either people kneeling and bowing in prayer, or kneeling and bowing, for example, to Baal. So, I mean, certainly these are very loaded words. I mean, these are certainly words of worship. But it's not all, but those words are a little ambiguous. That is, they don't always refer to gestures of worship. I mean, these words can also just be used to describe the ways that the human beings show respect to one another. For example, and this was a part of our scripture reading on Sunday. You remember, on Sunday we had the passage from Genesis where Jacob wrestles with God. And this takes place when Jacob is on his way back to see his brother Esau. And remember, I mean, Jacob and Esau got into this big fight because Jacob kept tricking his brother Esau out of the family inheritance, the family blessing, until finally Jacob ran away from home in fear of his brother. And now, after all these years, Jacob is going to go back and see Esau again and hopes to reconcile with him. And so, you know, in our reading on Sunday, you have Jacob. He's sending all of his family and his flocks ahead of him. You know, that is, he sends his wives, his children ahead of him because he's hoping that they can sort of soften Esau before he sees his brother. And then finally, this takes place in Genesis 33 when Jacob finally sees Esau, that he bows down to Esau as a gesture of respect. And in fact, even Jacob's children bow down to their uncle Esau. And it's these same verbs, these same verbs that the Bible uses to speak of this gesture of respect. So I bring that up just to say that again, these forms of kneeling, bowing, they are certainly used to describe the ways that people worship God, but they're also used to describe the ways that pious, God-fearing people show respect to each other. So this is not simply a matter of saying, in Esther, it would be too simple to say that the king has commanded everyone to bow down to Haman, and this is simply a clear form of idolatry. Nobody should ever bow down to another human being except God. That's not quite the case. Again, the verbs that are used here in Esther, people, again, God-fearing people do bow down to one another as a form of respect, and not always in ways that are idolatrous. And so there's something more going on here, because clearly Mordecai has a problem doing this. And again, there may be a little bit of a hint of a suggestion that Haman is being idolatrous by asking everyone to show him this respect. And in fact, eventually, Haman's reaction to Mordecai does suggest, Haman reacts to Mordecai's refusal to bow. Haman's response to this does show that Haman does have a problem with idolatry. That is, Haman views himself as so important, so deserving of honor and respect, that there is an idolatry to that. His fragile ego, his insistence on being respected, this is not good. This is not what we want from our human leaders. They should be respected, but then when he does not get respect, there in verse 5, he's infuriated. But this is such an interesting point that in verse 6, but he thought it was beneath him to deal with the matter directly himself. That is, Haman thought so highly of himself and so poorly of Mordecai that he would not just address that matter one-on-one with Mordecai. He had to have other people do it for him. It was beneath his dignity to address this problem. And so he just goes over the top in his response and is going to wipe out, all the Jews in the kingdom. to try to get back at Mordecai. Now that should, I think that makes maybe makes us think of Matthew 18, where Jesus says when you have a problem with somebody, you go deal with that person directly. You don't go around them. That's
Right.
Jesus says, when your brother sins against you, speak to your brother when you are alone. And if it doesn't work out, then you can get a couple other people involved to help you resolve it. If that doesn't work, you can bring it to the church. So Jesus lays out this process where we can deal with people who have offended us. But Jesus says, first of all, deal with it directly. Deal with it, and even privately, he says. Don't make a big deal out of it. But again, Haman, with this outsized ego, he's not going to deal with it directly, but is going to drag a lot of other people to do it for him. So, I would say there is an element of idolatry about Haman. Haman, sort of like Nebuchadnezzar asking, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to bow down to that big statue that he'd made. There's something about that here with Haman. Haman sees himself as a big statue. Haman sees himself, as worthy of everybody's respect. And so I would say there is perhaps something about that, with Mordecai refusing to do that. It is sort of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego saying, we're not going to bow to this statue. And as Christians, I think that is some of the wisdom that is required of us, is to have that kind of a sense. Some people call it a crap detector. That we kind of know, wait a second. We do show obedience to government, again, going back to Romans 13. But there are those moments when we say, this is going too far. That, again, when the apostles are told they are not supposed to preach in the name of Jesus, they say, wait a second, this is idolatry. This has crossed a line. And there's, I would say, something about that here with Mordecai. He senses that with Haman. Come on, pal. Okay, fine, I can respect you. But you're asking for more than simply, obedience, respect. You're asking for worship here. You want to be treated like God himself, and that goes too far. So again, that is part of what's going on here in this battle between Haman and Mordecai. But I want to go now one step further with this, because I find this very, I think, enlightening about what is going on in Esther and some of the kind of the bigger context and how this fits in the history of Israel. You may remember now that Mordecai, he is this faithful Jew. And do you remember that Mordecai himself has an interesting lineage in the people of Israel? Do you remember this? This came up earlier in Esther, that we find that on Mordecai's family tree is no less than the very first king of Israel. Let's see, that goes back to the second chapter of Esther. In Esther chapter 2, verse 5, okay, this is when Mordecai is first introduced. Okay, Mordecai, Esther's cousin who raised her. In Esther 2, verse 5, it says, now there was a Jew in the citadel of Susa whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Okay, that tells us that's important, because there was, again, the very first king of Israel was King Saul, who was also this son of Kish, a Benjaminite. So when Esther tells us this, that should make some little bells go off and make us think, well, this is interesting. Mordecai, sort of one of the heroes of this story of Esther, he was descended from the same family as King Saul. Mordecai has some royal lineage. And that's not just a coincidence. Okay, this isn't just a detail that's mentioned just so that we might then just forget it. That's important now, and this really confirms it now in this third chapter of Esther, when we find that Haman, the villain of this story, also has an important family tree. Because in the first verse of chapter 3, we find out that Haman is the son of Hammedatha the Agagite. That might not be a name that really rings any bells right away, but that is an important part of Israel's history. because that name Agag, Agagite, means he's from the family of Agag. And Agag only comes up in a couple of places in Scripture. There's one brief reference. I think it's in Numbers. But the story of Agag gets told back earlier in the book of 1 Samuel. And in fact, and actually, it really even in some ways goes back even further into Exodus. So if you would, as we so often do, keep your finger in Esther for a moment, okay? We're going to turn back into Exodus here, because this is going to sort of set the stage and help us understand the dynamic now that's going on in Esther between Haman and Mordecai. The villain and one of the heroes of this story. Go back to Exodus chapter 17. The story of God's people and their journey from slavery to freedom, from Egypt to the Promised Land. Exodus 17, you can see it begins this chapter with the miraculous water from the rock when the Israelites were thirsty. But then look at verse 8. Okay, we're going to hear about Amalek, one of the enemies of the Israelites. So the Israelites are journeying in the wilderness from Egypt to the Promised Land. And let's find out what happens on the way. It says, Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, Choose some men for us and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the sun set. And Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with a sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, Write this as a reminder in a book and recite it in the hearing of Joshua. I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called it, The Lord is my banner. He set a hand upon the banner of the Lord. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So as the Israelites are traveling on this exodus through the wilderness to the Promised Land, there are along the way some people they meet who actually help them out, provide for them, are kind to them. There are others who are less gracious to the Israelites on their journey, who oppose them, fight with them, try to stop them. And this is the story of these people, the Amalek and his people. And so because Amalek opposes Israel, the Israelites fight against them, and God himself says there in verse 14, I will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. God lays his curse upon the people of Amalek. Okay, so now, go forward into 1 Samuel. So go, we're going to be a little bit past the Pentateuch here, past these first 5 books of the Bible. Into the book of 1 Samuel now, when the people of Israel finally are now living in the Promised Land. And who is the king of Israel at this point? Well, of course, it's Saul, the very first king of Israel. This is Mordecai's, perhaps great-great-grandfather. So Saul is on the throne. And remember, God has this grudge against the people of Amalek, because they oppose the Israelites in their journey through the wilderness. So now in 1 Samuel 15, look at this. Samuel, the prophet, said to Saul, The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish the Amalekites for what they did in opposing the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So Saul, the king, summoned the people and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 soldiers of Judah. Saul came to the city of the Amalekites and lay in wait in the valley. Saul said to the Kenites, "Go, leave, withdraw from among the Amalekites, or I will destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the people of Israel when they came up out of Egypt." So just pause there for a moment. Again, when Israel was traveling, some of the neighbors were kind and provided for the Israelites. Some opposed them and fought against them. So Saul does meet these people who are kind to them along the way and says, "Now I'm going to spare you. You guys get out of here before the trouble starts." So the Kenites withdrew from the Amalekites. Verse 7, Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. He took King Agag of the Amalekites alive, but utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and of the cattle and of the fatlings and the lambs and all that was valuable, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless, they utterly destroyed. Now let's pause for a moment. What did God command Saul to do? To wipe out, to kill, to destroy the Amalekites. And there were times, there were times when God commanded his people to go to war with other nations, and actually, in some cases, to spare some of the people. Not in this case. In this case, there was to be no mercy. This was to be a wholesale slaughter of the Amalekites for what they had done by God's command. And so then verse 10, the word of the Lord came to Samuel, "I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands." Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all night. Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, and Samuel was told, Saul went to Carmel, where he set up a monument for himself, and on returning he passed on down to Gilgal. When Samuel came to Saul, Saul said to him, "May you be blessed by the Lord. I have carried out the command of the Lord." All right, Saul is very proud of himself. He says, "I did just what God asked me to do," but he didn't. So verse 14, Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of cattle that I hear?" Again, God said, wipe out everything, even the sheep. And so Saul says, "I did it." And then Samuel said, "Well, if you really did what God said, why do I hear all these animals making noise?" And Saul, verse 15, Saul said, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but the rest we have utterly destroyed." Okay, so Saul makes an excuse. He says, "Well, sure, I didn't do what God said, but I kept some of these things alive so he can make a nice sacrifice for God." Well, do you think God is impressed with this? No. Verse 16, Samuel said to Saul, "Stop. I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night." He replied, "Speak." Samuel said, "Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and the Lord sent you on a mission and said, 'Go, utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed.' Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord?" Saul said to Samuel, "I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me. I have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But from the spoil of the people, the people took sheep and cattle, the best of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal." So Saul's still making excuses here. "No, you're right, I didn't do what God said, but I had a good intention. The road to hell is paved with them. Saul has got good intentions here." And Samuel, the prophet, said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obedience to the voice of the Lord? Surely to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is no less a sin than divination, and stubbornness is like iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." Saul, this is a very harsh word that the prophet delivers against King Saul. And so Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned." Finally, Saul admits it. Finally, Saul says, "I'm sorry. I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now, therefore, I pray, pardon my sin, and return with me so that I may worship the Lord." Samuel said to Saul, "I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel." As Samuel turned to go away, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this very day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you." Now, who is that? That would be little David, the little shepherd boy. That's going to be the next king of Israel. Verse 29, "Moreover, the glory of Israel will not recant or change his mind, for he is not a mortal that he should change his mind." Then Saul said, "I have sinned, yet honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me, so that I may worship the Lord your God." So Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. So actually Samuel, the prophet, is being nice, kind to the king. He goes back with him. I mean, he's going to bless him, honor him with his presence. So Samuel does, so that Saul doesn't look like a total buffoon in front of the people. And then listen to this now. This, again, Agag here. What's going to happen? Old King Agag. Well, in verse 32, Samuel said, "Bring Agag, king of the Amalekites, here to me." And Agag came to him haltingly. Agag said, "Surely this is the bitterness of death." But Samuel said, and I got to say, when Agag says that, that does not sound like a very sincere statement. This sounds like sarcasm. I mean, Agag here is boasting. "Oh, boy, aren't I afraid of you, you weak little prophet? What are you going to do to me?" Well, Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so your mother shall be childless among women." And Samuel hewed Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house in Gibeah of Saul. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord was sorry that he had made Saul king over Israel. And so finally now we come to David, who becomes the next. He's chosen by God to be the next king over Israel. And all of this because Saul would not listen to the voice of the Lord. Saul, God says, "Do this." And Saul said, "Well, yeah, I know you told me to do this, Lord, but I have a better idea. I have a special way that I'm going to show you my love and devotion." I mean, this is a problem. Yeah, when God says to do something and we think we have better ideas, we have better ways of showing our devotion to God than just simply listening to him. And so Saul is rejected. And that disobedience was part of that disobedience was sparing Agag, the king of the Amalekites. When the Israelites were leaving Egypt, the Amalekites opposed Israel. And God said, "I am going to wipe the Amalekites out." And when God finally set about to keep that promise, to fulfill that curse upon the Amalekites, he asked Saul, the king, to do it for him. And Saul refused. He let Agag live. Now, Agag did not live for long. The prophet himself took the sword and fulfilled that curse upon the Amalekites, killed their king Agag. But now look at this. Now turn back to Esther. Go back to Esther chapter 3. There are still these Amalekites alive, still children of that king Agag. Here we have an Agagite, Haman. This living reminder to the Israelites of what happens when they do not listen to God. Saul was one of the most notable among the Israelites who ignored God, did not do what he commanded. There were many Israelite kings, actually, who followed Saul in idolatry, in disobedience against God, refusing to do what God said, worshiping other gods. And finally, all of that disobedience resulted in the Israelites being conquered by their enemies, kicked off their land, killed, exiled. The reason why Mordecai and Esther find themselves living in Persia is because of King Saul and all of the Israelites who followed him. refusing to worship the Lord, to listen to God, to obey him. And so here now in exile, here we have the living fruit of that idolatry and disobedience. God told Saul to wipe out the Amalekites. He didn't. And so here we have a living Amalekite. You know, if Saul had done what God said, this Haman would never have been born. This Haman would not be alive if Saul had done what God had said. And so now the fruits of that disobedience, the fruits of that idolatry are right here in front of the Jews, Mordecai, Esther, because Haman, the descendant of Agag now, is going to hatch this plot. Is going to demand, again, this form of idolatry. He wants everybody to bow down to him. And when they don't, he's going to enact the plan to wipe out the Jews. So when we see now this plan, this wicked Haman and his plan to wipe out the Jews, it is a reminder for God of his people of what happens when they don't listen to him, when they refuse to worship, refuse to obey, go chasing after other gods. Haman now, the Agagite. Okay, this isn't just a coincidence, all right? Mordecai himself is a descendant of King Saul who refused to do what God said. And it turns out Haman, the villain of Esther, is a descendant of Agag. Okay, again, there's only a couple places where Agag turns up in Scripture. The passage we just read from 1 Samuel, now again in Esther. Okay, not just a coincidence. This is an old story. It's an old battle, a battle between these two nations, Israel and the Amalekites. But it's also this battle between idolatry and faith, a battle between obedience and disobedience against the Lord that's now going to be enacted. But the beautiful thing about this is that, again, for King Saul, the consequence of his disobedience was that he lost the kingdom, he lost his life. For the Israelites who followed him, the consequence of their disobedience and idolatry was destruction, death, and exile. But now finally, in this story of Esther, we see that in this great battle now, because Mordecai refuses to worship this idol, Haman, because he insists on trusting in the Lord, and because of these bravery of these Jews who put themselves in the hands of God, really because of their faith, they find redemption for themselves and for their people. And even though, we've said this now in Esther, the Lord himself is not mentioned by name. The Lord himself is, you don't see the name God in this story, in this book of Esther. God is all over this book. Again, there's this conflict right here in this third chapter between the people who are commanded to obey God and listen to him, as Saul was once commanded to do, versus the people who opposed God. So again, this big conflict in Israel's history shows us that, again, even though God is not mentioned by name, God is just all part of this story. And then in verse 4 here, in Esther chapter 3, verse 4, the question is whether or not Mordecai's words would avail. Now, when we talk about Mordecai's words here, it is his refusal to bow down to Haman. But really, this is Mordecai's words, but it's more than Mordecai's words. This is also about whether or not God's words are going to prevail, whether God's words are going to stand. Because God has told his people to stand up against these Agagites, these Amalekites. And Saul thought God's words would not stand. Saul thought his own ideas were more important than God's words. But now we're going to see in this story that indeed God's words are going to stand. God is going to defend his people against these enemies who oppose the Israelites. Indeed, Is God a part of this story? He certainly is. This is a story about faith versus idolatry. Just some interesting points here about this third chapter. Again, these rulers in this book are not treated very sympathetically. I mean, King Ahasuerus, last week we said there's sort of a bit of a sympathetic treatment for the king when he marries Esther. You see sort of this human element finally come out of this king who falls in love with this queen. But so often in the book of Esther, these royals are they're just despicable people. And they're kind of despised and looked down on, made fun of. And I mean, that's going on once again here. It's just so funny in verses 3 and 4 when Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. Haman, it seems, doesn't even notice this at first. I mean, look at this. In verse 4. These servants are trying to get Mordecai to obey, but he refuses. And then finally, when the servants they talk to Mordecai about this, in verse 4 they finally tell Haman. It's only these servants who kind of rat on Mordecai. They're tattletales. And these servants aren't very noble people themselves. But it seems Haman probably didn't even notice this. I mean, Haman was so full of himself, he didn't even notice that Mordecai was standing up, refusing to bow. And Haman just kept going, not even realizing this until the servants themselves tattled and told Haman. And then finally, Haman flies off the handle, gets all upset about this. But not a very sympathetic treatment here, once again, of these royals who are so full of themselves. And then we'll continue next week then in verse 7. And I think we can really, we just went through 6 verses today, but next week I think we can really plunge through the rest of this chapter 3, where you really see now the consequence of this Haman's anger, what he's going to do, the plot now. But it's already been stated for us in verse 6. I mean, his plan now is to wipe out all the Jews because one of the Jews wouldn't bow down to him. And in some ways, I mean, maybe in some crazy way, this does make sense. I mean, Haman is right. I mean, this is not just Mordecai's problem. I mean, this is not just Mordecai and his refusal to bow. This is an entire people who have a higher allegiance, just like for us as Christians. All of us have this higher allegiance to God. If tyrants are going to try to wipe out disobedience, if tyrants, will not allow anybody to disagree with them. They can't just wipe out one Christian. They would have to get rid of all of us, because we all trust that God indeed is the King of Kings. But we'll see how well Haman's plot goes. We'll see how well Haman does against the Lord and his people. So we'll pause right there and just ask any reflections, responses, comments, questions. What do you think? The book of Esther, where Esther, just kind of comes in and out of the story. Again, we didn't, in the beginning of the story, we didn't even hear about Esther. Now she's sort of disappeared again. But she'll be back. We'll get to hear more from her soon.
I suppose. Go ahead.
Pastor, what I want to do is learn how to connect these different verses, like you did with Exodus and Samuel and all that.
Unknown color.
What happened?
Oh, go ahead, Denise. I can hear you.
So I was kind of like getting a little twist out of what you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this guy Haman is going to kill all the Jews because one man wouldn't bow to him.
That's right.
Now, God told Saul to kill all the, what you call them?
The Amalekites.
Amalekites.
Yep.
And he spared one. So,
Yeah.
I'm looking at this, kind of like a twist or a play
Yeah,
on this
it is.
type of thing. I don't really know how to put it in.
It's a real irony. Yeah, it's a real irony that why does God tell the Israelites to wipe out the Amalekites? Yeah, because the Amalekites oppose them. God was also concerned, and you can see this in those first 5 books of the Bible, but also as it continues in Joshua and Judges. If you read through this story of Israel in the Promised Land, is God was very concerned to both wipe out the people who used to live there because of their idolatry and the horrible things they did. I mean, one of the things these people did was sacrifice children. That part of their religion was to kill and mutilate children. God was, fed up with this and said, okay, that's enough. And so God told the Israelites to wipe these people out. But also, God's concern was to get rid of idolatry that would tempt his people. And so that's why when God had these wholesale commands to destroy Israel's neighbors, it was these people who lived closest to Israel who would present the greatest threat of temptation to idolatry. Those are the ones that God told to wipe out. Not sparing anybody. There is sort of you could say sort of a logic to it when God has his people destroy these neighbors, these other nations. And I guess one of the biggest contrasts with Haman is that for Haman, it's just a personal insult. It's not that the Jews presented some big national threat to the Persians. In fact, every time the Jews get involved in Esther, every time the Jews get involved in Persian politics, it is for the benefit of the Persian government. That is, Ahasuerus gets a new queen. Mordecai, we just heard last week, it was Mordecai who discovered the plot to assassinate the king. Remember that? And that's going to come back in the story later on. But, the Jews continue to actually be a blessing to their government. And so for Haman to try to wipe out the Jews, it wasn't because the Jews presented any threat to the kingdom. It was the opposite. It was just purely personal. And so that would be the difference between Haman and God, and then God, on the other hand, God commanding Israel to wipe out the Amalekites. It wasn't that Saul, had some personal gripe against Agag or something. It was God making a home for his people, punishing sin, and wiping out temptation, protecting his people from temptation. Again, very different from Haman and his ego. Haman's Holocaust is just personal. It is just about his personal ego.
Right.
Yeah, so that is different. But you're right to notice that irony. Yeah.
Pastor?
Yeah.
If all the Jews would have been destroyed,
Yeah.
that would have been a way Satan was trying to destroy the coming Messiah.
That's right. Yeah,
Amen.
that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. God promised the Messiah would come from the Jews, and so yeah, all these attempts to destroy, and you are very right to see that dimension, and that's important for us also to recognize. When the Israelites are traveling from Egypt to the Promised Land, and the Amalekites come out and oppose them. That's not just sort of a matter of geopolitics, that God doesn't like it when one nation is mean to another. That's certainly true. God does not want nations to treat each other poorly. But, the bigger spiritual dimension of this is that when the Amalekites oppose Israel, they oppose the people who will one day produce for the world a Messiah, the Messiah. When Haman's going to wipe out the Jews, this is Satan trying to prevent the arrival of the Lord. That is great.
Good point, yeah.
Yep, really good point. Yeah. Good. Other questions, comments?
I guess that's it, huh?
I guess that's it. All right, good. Then grab your hymnals. We're going to sing a hymn that we've sung recently, hymn number 170. This hymn, Crown and with Many Crowns. Our Our earthly governments are important and are a blessing from God, certainly in need of our prayer, our service, obedience. But we do always reserve our faith and ultimate worship for Jesus Christ. And so today, let's sing verses 1 and 5. Just a wonderful statement of praise from God. And expresses also our hope, that one day because of this king, all of these wars are going to cease because we will be absorbed in prayer and praise. God's scepter one day will declare peace for the nations, instead of all these endless wars and all these leaders with their egos. Thank God for the King of Peace, who came not to be served, but to serve. So we'll sing hymn number 170, and we'll do verses 1 and 5. I'll just do a little bit of this one here. Crown him with many crowns, the Lamb upon his throne. Hark how the heavenly anthem drowns all music but its own. Awake, my soul, and sing of him who died for thee, and hail him as thy matchless King through all eternity. Crown him the Lord of peace, whose power a scepter sways. From pole to pole that wars may cease, absorbed in prayer and praise. His reign shall know no end, and round his pierced feet fair flowers of paradise extend, their fragrance ever sweet. Yeah, that is both a hymn of praise and prayer. That is our prayer and hope. Looking forward to that day. So let's pray. Let's ask that God's kingdom would come, as Jesus taught us to do. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right. Good to see you all. I'll just try to unmute everybody here just to say goodbye. But it's good to see your faces, good to hear your voices. We'll see you next time. Have a good weekend. Stay warm.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See ya.